Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Russian Far East. The village of Termalny is a small town surrounded by forest and mountains. This village is situated on the Kamchatka Peninsula, which extends into the Pacific Ocean and the Bering Sea on the east and the Sea of Okhotsk on the west. The plant life consists of thick undergrowth and dense forests of fir and pine, as well as deciduous trees. The animal life includes wolves, deer, and elk, as well as the usual array of smaller animals like squirrels, foxes, and birds. It is as natural an environment as one could seek for. The area is very much like Yellowstone National Park, with geysers, hot springs, mud pots, and even has several volcanoes. The peninsula makes up part of the Ring of Fire, which is a series of volcanoes surrounding the immense Pacific Ocean. Igor Tsyganenkov and his stepdaughter Olga Moskalyova were on a camping trip near a local river and fishing in late August of 2011. The pair apparently returned to camp to find that Igor had forgotten a fishing pole on the bank of the river, so they decided to return together to recover it. They arrived at the location and began searching for the fishing pole amongst the reeds and tall grass lining the riverbank when there was a rustling in the grass behind them. They were several yards apart, but within sight of one another, when a large brown bear emerged from the grass and slowly proceeded toward Igor. He began yelling and backed up further into the reeds along the bank. The sow stretched out her paws and clasped the man by the shoulders and slowly wrestled him to the ground. She swatted him and bit him until she managed to clench her jaws on his neck. Tossing her head back and forth forcefully, she broke his neck. Olga next saw the bear stomping on his head and torso, smashing his skull. His broken body lay still as the bear's 3 cubs trotted over to their mom's side. Seeing her stepfather killed before her very eyes, Olga turned and ran in panic. The sow bear diverted her energy and attention away from Igor and focused on Olga. The 19-year-old girl was fit and healthy, but only covered about 70 yards before the bear grabbed her from behind and pulled her to the ground by biting her leg. The bear immediately batted her from side to side, dragging her a short distance, and seemed to toy with her, like a cat with a mouse. She apparently hadn't made up her mind on what to do with the young woman. The bear bit down on her now bleeding leg and began biting chunks of flesh off and eating them. The horror of the scene seemed surreal and is the substance of nightmares. Olga could feel the bear biting and tearing her flesh and knew her stepfather was dead, so she did the only thing she could do. She used her cell phone to call her mother. Fighting back was obviously futile, as Igor was overpowered in no time, so she hoped to have someone come and rescue her. Tatiana, Olga's mother, answered the phone to hear her beloved daughter screaming, "Mom, the bear is eating me! Mom, it's such agony! Help me, Mom!" And initially thought it was a prank, as Olga was known to be fun-loving and enjoyed laughing. But then Tatiana picked up on the tone of her daughter's voice. She was terrified and in obvious pain. She could also hear the bear growling and chewing on Olga. This phone call lasted for the better part of an hour. She knew this was a serious situation and no joke, as she'd hoped. Having lost communication, Tatiana decided to call Igor and see what was really going on. She called his number, but he did not answer. She had no idea Igor was already dead. She called the police and her relatives to get them to go and save Igor and Olga. It was then that her phone rang again. It was Olga, and her voice was now very weak. She told her mother, "Mom, the bears came back, and she brought her 3 babies. They're eating me." The call dropped again, and Tatiana frantically tried to get more people to help. About 20 minutes later, Tatiana's phone rang one last time, and again it was Olga. The bears had apparently eaten their fill and left her to die. Olga must have known she was on the verge of death and wanted to say goodbye to her mother. Tatiana answered the phone and heard Olga utter, "Mom, it isn't hurting anymore. I don't feel the pain. Forgive me for everything. I love you so much." The call dropped for the last time. It took about 30 minutes for Igor's brother and Olga's uncle, Andrei, to arrive with police. They approached a horrifying scene covered in Olga's blood and could see the 4 bears still eating Igor's body. The 6 hunters who agreed to shoot the bear immediately shot the sow and her 3 cubs. Olga's mauled and mangled corpse was found nearby. Conflicts like this are not uncommon in this area of the Far East, where humans are settling in territory where bears find their food sources. There was no further report on the health of the bears, but it seemed clearly to be a predatory attack and the ending of 2 precious human lives. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Thank you to Zolt Monastery for emailing and encouraging me to put together this episode. Today's episode takes us to a location 8 miles west of the town of West Yellowstone, to a trail called Buttermilk Trail. The geography here is high elevation, with nearby Bald Peak breaking the 10,000-foot high mark, and the valleys are consistently above 6,500 feet. Common plants in this area are pine, fir, and spruce trees, which cover the land like a giant green army that sways in every breeze. Along the creeks and lakes you will find willow bushes that hide mule deer and white-tailed deer, elk, moose, and even a few mountain goats on the high peaks. The common predators here include wolves, cougars, black bears, and a rapidly growing and spreading population of grizzly bears. If this area sounds familiar, it is probably because this will be the 3rd grizzly bear attack we will cover within a 30-minute car drive from each other. The attack on Todd Orr and Karl Mach happened very near this location and begs the question, why are all these attacks happening just over the park boundary? Amy Adamson was 48 years old and was a former English teacher. She had left her profession to backpack across the nation and use her experiences to write a book she planned on titling Walking Out, One Teacher's Reflections on Walking Out of the Classroom to Walk America. Amy was very active and in amazing shape. She was an avid hiker and ran marathons from time to time. Her hometown was Darby, Kansas, which is quite a contrast to where she was spending her summer. She was working at Yellowstone National Park as a seasonal employee and had fallen in love with the area the moment she laid eyes on it. The Buttermilk Trail was one of her favorite places to go for a jog early in the morning, and she routinely came here to get away. The trail is a favorite for hikers, horseback riders, and people driving off-road vehicles, so she knew she would have people around her as she jogged. She wore her favorite running shoes and wasn't in the regular practice of carrying bear spray on her when she hit the trail. She didn't pack a firearm with her either. Just before 8 a.m. on July 22nd of 2023, Amy arrived at the parking lot near the trailhead. Nearby there was an RV park and private campground packed with plenty of visitors and around 20 cabins almost always rented to full capacity. Amy hiked to the trailhead and started a slow-paced jog. She quickly climbed only a few hundred yards when something tragic she hadn't anticipated happened. Maybe 15 minutes behind Amy was another hiker who had just begun to climb the same trail. We will protect this hiker's name out of respect for their privacy. As the hiker traveled only a few hundred yards up the trail, he came across Amy's body lying just off the trail. She was clearly dead, and there was evidence of a brief struggle around her. The hiker could also see fresh grizzly tracks from a large and a small bear. The hiker immediately left the area to get help. Investigators quickly made their way to the location reported by the hiker. They saw the tracks of a sow bear and her smaller cub, but a search for a food cache, daybed, or the presence of the bears yielded nothing. Wardens from the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks cooperated with the investigators of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services to investigate the attack. Along with the bear track evidence at the site, the investigators stated that Amy had apparently died from wounds inflicted by a bear attack. The coroner later announced she had died from loss of blood, which usually takes at least several minutes unless a major blood vessel is severed, which can cause a person to bleed to death in a matter of seconds to minutes. The investigators also noticed that Amy was hiking or jogging alone. They deemed the attack a defensive attack given the bears consumed no part of Amy's body and did not cache her corpse for consumption later. The bears also immediately departed the area and offered no defense of her corpse. Officials announced an emergency closure of the Buttermilk Trail system to remain closed until August 25th this summer. All human entry is prohibited and enforced by rangers. Wildlife agents placed culvert traps out in the area and hope to catch the sow and her cub. Time is of the essence in catching the bear involved because as the days pass, the odds of catching a different bear than the offending one increase. The DNA evidence on the bear's claws will only be viable for a few days, after which being certain they have trapped the attacking sow will be impossible due to the degradation of the DNA. A trail camera placed by the agents did capture a grizzly sow with 2 cubs on the night of the attack, but no further sightings of the trio have occurred since. Searches by aircraft yielded no sightings, no evidence, and no hope of tracking down the bears. Authorities have not decided exactly what action should be taken against the sow and her cubs. Killing the bear would eliminate a bear that has killed a person, but she was also only doing what sow bears are supposed to do, defending her cubs from a perceived threat. The other option is to relocate the bear to a more remote area, but this solution also has its trade-offs. If they relocate the sow and her cubs, she will be considered an interloper on the territory of any bears already claiming that area. She may be pushed out of that territory and back toward human population centers. This brings up a topic we have discussed briefly on other episodes on this channel. Bear researchers have reported that sow bears are increasingly choosing to move their cubs right into human-occupied areas, just like the Buttermilk Trailhead area. Places surrounded by human development and activity tend to drive away the dangerous boar bears that prey on young bear cubs. The sows that do this tend to be larger in size and have more cubs due to the availability of food, safety, human tolerance, and even adoration of their presence. The co-owner of the West Yellowstone Rodeo and Creekside Trail Rides, Laura Skinner, states that horseback ride tours have not dropped off due to the report of Amy's mauling and death. She states that people who live in the area are used to seeing them and are watchful for them. She says that her guide service simply sends a rider ahead of all of their riding tours to make sure there are no bears they might run into on the ride. She continues by saying that with all of the activity of authorities trying to find the sow and her cubs, she is sure they are far from the area. My experience with grizzlies in the area is equally alarming. In the fall of 2022, both of my sons drew antlered moose tags in a hunting unit adjacent to Yellowstone National Park. My family has hunted there for elk, deer, and moose for over 45 years, and moose hunting here used to be more like grocery shopping. Moose could be found easily, and populations were very high in density. Last fall, we hunted for 3 weeks over the months of September, October, and November, and spoke with several elk hunters who had run into bears while stalking their prey. We noticed grizzly bear tracks in the fresh-fallen snow on roads. At one point, we were driving along the Mesa Falls Scenic Byway, which merges with Highway 20 and continues to the town of Island Park. I noticed a small hollow with about 20 pine trees growing out of it about 100 yards off the road, and decided I would walk out to those trees to relieve myself. To our east was a forest of pine trees, and on the west side of the road was sagebrush. Less than 1 mile across the brush, we could see Highway 20. Just as I got ready to get out and walk to the pine stand, I saw a big dark brown object that resembled a dog sitting on its haunches. I was sure it was a stump because what on earth would a grizzly bear be doing in the sagebrush between 2 highways? As I watched in amazement, the bear stood up and slowly walked parallel to our position on the byway and toward the south. It was walking toward a small sawmill that we observed in operation earlier that day. My first thought was that the sawyer may still be running his equipment and would be completely oblivious that the bear was headed toward him. We watched as the bear slowly disappeared and reappeared as it ambled through the slight folds in the sagebrush, getting closer to the sawmill. We turned our truck around and drove the 1/4 mile to the sawmill and searched for the man who was running it. He was not there, which put us at ease. We watched as the grizzly walked toward the back side of the sawmill site. We drove around to the back to watch it for a while. The ground had only a few feet of low folds in it and only sagebrush for cover. That massive grizzly bear disappeared within 50 yards of us, and we could not find it again despite searching from the safety of our truck for 30 minutes. Grizzly populations in the U.S. Rocky Mountains have grown quickly, and bears have been showing up in surprising locations not previously known as their habitat. Since 2010, grizzlies have killed 9 people in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem area. This area is not the only area that has seen a sharp uptick in bear attacks. This year alone has had fatal or serious bear attacks in Arizona, North Carolina, and Colorado, each of which are already or will be episodes on our channel. After hearing the details of Amy's fatal grizzly attack and the other information I have presented, I have a few questions for you. Do you think Amy's familiarity with the place she loved so much prevented her from bringing bear spray on her run? Do you think she would have even had time to dispense her bear spray if she had it? Was her attack a matter of the wrong time, wrong place? Would you have expected to run into a sow and her cubs right next to an RV campground and occupied cabins? Why do bears view humans as a threat but still feel comfortable near human populations? What will you do to ensure your safety when you venture into bear country in the future? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to familiar territory. You guessed it. We're going back to the area around Yellowstone National Park, to a backcountry trail system that includes the Pelican Trailhead. I'm sure you are familiar with the geography and plant life around the national park, especially given we have done almost 10 episodes discussing attacks in this area. The forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees are interrupted by broad meadows of grass, with secretive patches of willows along the shore of any body of water. If you hike into the right places, you can see for miles and witness what some visitors call the American Serengeti. It is a comparison between the packed plains and savannas of Africa crowded with wildebeest, zebra, and predators like the African lion. The most substantial difference is bison and elk crowd. These meadows and the predators here are much more powerful and every bit as dangerous. On July 28, 1984, 25-year-old Brigitte Friedenhagen was visiting the park with a couple of her family members, along with her brother Andreas and his wife Janko. They were all from Switzerland and decided to visit Yellowstone National Park and other interesting locations in the U.S. together. Brigitte was adventuresome and possibly a little too much so. As they cruised the roads surrounding and inside the park, she was clearly drawn off of this all-too-beaten path to a more remote and backcountry experience. Now, Andreas and Janko were adventuresome, but not to the point of foolhardiness. They knew Brigitte was wanting to explore wild things and have immersive experiences in nature, but they were not so inclined to participate. They listened as Brigitte explained her plans to hike from the Pelican Trailhead all on the 30th, then camp out at a backcountry campsite. Then finish off the hike out to Wapiti Trailhead on the 31st to meet with her brother and sister-in-law in the trailhead parking lot. They looked on as she explained the gear she had brought in anticipation of her solo adventure into the wild. She had packed her foam pad and sleeping bag, a flashlight along with a small tape recorder to commemorate the events as she hiked. She searched through her gear and made sure she had packed her blue jeans and her flannel shirt, plus her other personal clothing items. She didn't take any cosmetics, as she planned to be alone, but did bring some sunblock for her lips as well as a prescribed respiratory stimulant known as Micarin. Beyond all of the standard backpacking gear, Brigitte also brought informational brochures she grabbed from any venue they had visited. Pamphlets named Beyond Road's End, Grizzly, 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 Enjoy Them at a Distance, and Yellowstone Trails would soon take a very ironic and sardonic meaning as her story unfolded. Keep in mind, bear spray had not been invented yet, or was possibly in its infancy of development. According to the research I completed, carrying a firearm was illegal in all national parks until it passed on a legislative rider on the Card Act of 2009. At the time of Brigitte's visit to the park, the latest and greatest information on grizzly bear attacks addressed surprising them as you hiked or ventured into their territory. Bear bells were considered the solution, so she packed those in her backpack as a preventative measure from attack. Brigitte was a very by-the-book kind of young lady. Every trail registry her group visited had her signature, just below the small billboards covered with posters discussing the presence and dangers that black bears and grizzlies present to visitors. There were posters with illustrations on how to suspend your food from trees while visiting the backcountry, and careful directions on proper disposal of food items as well. Brigitte took careful notes of all of it and immediately put every bit of it into practice. On July 29th, Brigitte, Andreas, and Janko entered the South Park entrance and drove to the Canyon Ranger Station. They had a brief dialogue with the rangers there and ended up purchasing a backcountry camping pass for Brigitte. She relayed her plans to the rangers, detailing her departure from the Pelican Trailhead and hiking into remote campsite 5B1 for the evening, then continuing along the Wapiti Trailhead to the parking lot to end her excursion. It was a simple one-night adventure that she had planned to do by herself, Her 10-mile hike into the campground would only be a couple of climbs of a few hundred feet, so most of her trail hiking was relatively flat. 10 miles for one day, then a peaceful night's rest under the stars in the wilderness. Sounds like a wonderful getaway. She was concerned, though, as she had discussed with her brother Andreas, the danger the animals in the brochure could pose while she was by herself. Nearly any animal in the brochure could be dangerous, and some of them were clearly temperamental about having humans in their area. Her mind wasn't only focused on the ill-tempered moose, but clearly more concerned about grizzly bears. Just before 11 a.m. on July 30th, Andreas and Janko drove Brigida to the Pelican trailhead. They hiked in with her for the first 5.5 miles, and they decided she wouldn't hike all the way down the Wapiti Trail to the trailhead. Instead, Brigida would hike a little further and pitch camp to stay the evening, then hike back to the Pelican trailhead to meet up with her brother and sister-in-law. They watched as she hefted her stuffed backpack onto her slender shoulders and then disappeared into the forest. Andreas and Janko undoubtedly felt some apprehension and anxiety as they watched her climb the trail, but knew that this is what she had wanted to do. They hiked back to the trailhead and drove their car back to their campsite to eagerly anticipate her arrival in 2 days. As the days passed, they drove their vehicle back to the Pelican trailhead and parked, optimistically waiting for Brigida to emerge, radiating with pride at the completion of her adventure. They passed the time with small talk and waited and waited. As the hours turned into the better part of the day, their worries began to grow. At around 5:30 p.m., their worries culminated into action, as Brigida had now missed their rendezvous time by 4 hours. Scenarios had to have flashed through their minds. Did she get enchanted by a breathtaking scene that made her spend time there, causing her to be late? Had she sprained her ankle and was immobilized while waiting for rescue? They chased away the thought of anything more serious occurring. They quickly drove to the Fishing Bridge Visitor Center and reported Brigida missing to the park rangers. An emergency plan of action was devised by the rangers and was immediately implemented. The next day, August 1st, Park Ranger Marshall covered the Astringent Creek Trail by horseback as Bill Berg and Colette Dagelberg searched around the Upper Pelican area of the trail system. A volunteer by the name of Nelson Scott covered the area between the two trails. This comprehensive search was thorough and made sure the entire trail system Brigida had indicated she would be traveling on was cleared. They searched at Campground 5B1 but found it unoccupied, and it appeared that no one had stayed there in at least a few days. As Ranger Marshall rode his horse along Astringent Trail, he looked for bear sign among the lodgepole and spruce stands. His professional training taught him to search for telltale activity that may not be picked up by your average hiker. Evidence that a bear would leave behind that may go unnoticed by the untrained eye. He found no scat or tracks along the trail, and there was no digging along meadows. Bears will oftentimes dig into the soil in meadows for roots or to catch and eat various rodents. The elk thistle and strawberry plants were undisturbed, and pocket gopher mounds remained intact. The ant hills in the area were untouched as well. It seemed eerily void of bear activity to the ranger. Just before 11:30 a.m., he arrived at Campground 5W1, which is no longer indicated on the backcountry campground map. Ranger Marshall discovered Brigida's camp. She had apparently not made the intended progress in her hike, as her campsite was placed several miles short of the backcountry campground on her permit, Site 5B1. He noticed some very concerning evidence at the campground and requested immediate assistance at the location. An investigative team was immediately flown into remote campsite 5W1. As the investigative team set out to gather any clues as to what happened to Brigida, her campsite seemed oddly organized and arrayed to be lacking her immediate presence. It looked as if she would walk out of the bushes nearby after investigating something that had caught her eye. Her tent was set to face west, and near the entry flap to her tent was a 27-inch long tear in the tent fabric. When the investigators lifted the tent flap, they could see her folded clothes placed inside a plastic bag near her foam sleeping pad. Beside the bag was her sunblock, a container of the respiratory stimulant Micarin, and a butane lighter still neatly placed on the left side of her sleeping pad. On the right side was her flashlight still in the off position, and a tape player with run-down batteries. Toward the back of the inside of her tent was her rucksack. Also in her tent was the remaining portion of a 100-gram chocolate bar inside of her rucksack. Brigida's sleeping bag was laid out flat about 6 feet behind her tent. It looked as if she had laid it out in the sun to dry after getting it wet. It was still zipped and velcroed closed. On her sleeping bag were additional signs of a bear attack. At the approximate location of Brigida's neck while she slept in the bag were puncture wounds approximately the size and spacing of a bear's canine teeth. About 18 inches below that was a tear in the sleeping bag fabric, possibly made by the bear's claws. The investigators could see that Brigida had suspended her food cache by twine between 2 trees a short distance from her tent, just as page 9 of the Yellowstone Trails book diagrammed. The contents were now pillaged by the bear and set out in an area about 3 feet square. Based on the evidence at the scene, Brigida had climbed into her sleeping bag after arranging her camp and tent to her liking and according to the safety guidelines in the brochures she had with her. Her head was positioned near her tent flap, and she had probably angled herself diagonally to offset a slight slant in the ground. The bear had apparently investigated her tent and may have smelled the scented lip sunscreen residue on her lips, or may have heard her breathing as she slept. The bear tore open her tent and bit onto either her skull or her neck and dragged her straight out of her tent through the rip while she remained inside her sleeping bag. About 6 feet from her tent, and where her sleeping bag now rested so neatly, she was pulled from her only remaining protection. From that point, the investigators followed a scarcely noticeable drag trail that went west of the campfire ring, across the trail, and uphill toward the trees to the northeast of the campground. Along this drag trail, they found Brigida's bloody sweater with rips and tears caused by the bear's claws and teeth. A few yards further along the drag trail, they found her cotton pullover t-shirt, now bloodied and made dirty from the bear attack. About 250 feet from her tent, the investigators found the remains of Brigida Friedenhagen. The Grizzly had partially consumed her corpse, and her remains were recovered for analysis by the coroner. Immediately after Brigida's death, the area around White Lake was closed to all visitors while the rangers placed bear traps and conducted surveillance on any bears found in the area. After looking over how Brigida had tied her food cache up in a tree, investigators surmised that the bear was able to climb the tree high enough to retrieve her food cache. They believed that the resulting attack on Brigida occurred because the bear had retrieved it and was initially protecting it from what it viewed as a threat to its food. The coroner found that Brigida had died from hemorrhage and shock due to multiple lacerations received during the bear attack. It was noted in the investigators' final report that she followed all safety guidelines recommended by the brochures and park officials. The investigative team used the track size and span of the tooth and claw wounds on Brigida's body to estimate the size and age of the bear that killed her. They guessed the bear to be between 2 and 3 years of age, making it a sub-adult bear, but no other details were offered regarding the sex or health of the bear, as it was never caught or killed. Given that DNA science could not be used at the time of the attack, there was no way investigators could conclude they had killed the bear that killed Brigida. They would have had to kill the bear before her tissues it had consumed had cleared its digestive system to be conclusively identified as human remains. That left only a day or so window to kill the bear and perform a necropsy and tissue extraction from its digestive system. This process was not completed in a manner that would strictly identify the bear that had attacked, killed, and consumed Brigida. In the aftermath of Brigida's death, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee reviewed and refined the park regulations for backcountry campers. Their analysis concluded that better ways to store food needed to be emphasized for backcountry campers. They also reviewed the proximity of campsites to trails that bears may travel. The proximity of cooking and campfire ring locations to the sleeping sites was reviewed, as well as campsite locations in comparison to preferred bear habitat. Finally, the committee recommended that single backcountry campers be discouraged, and the public be made aware that groups are much safer than being alone in bear country. A public awareness program was put together to ensure people venturing into the backcountry for camping were aware of the risks of doing so. Even though these changes were accepted and implemented too late to avoid Brigida's horrible demise, they may have been instrumental in protecting backcountry campers since her attack. Brigida Friedenhagen was the first person killed in the park since 1972, to the point of her death. Since population assessments were initiated in 1975, grizzly bear numbers have increased from 136 to over 1,063 in 2021. The grizzlies have also increased their occupied habitat by over 50%. When you add those two trend lines, you can see that by increasing the grizzly populations by nearly tenfold, while only increasing the area from which they draw resources by 50%, it is easy to conclude that grizzly numbers are at an overpopulated threshold and may be overburdening their food and territorial resources. This stress on grizzlies may lead to continued and increasing incidents of them venturing closer to human civilization. Postscript. Former park ranger Jerry Mernon wrote about a nuisance bear in his book titled Yellowstone Ranger. Bear number 88 was a young male who weighed 375 pounds and had developed a history of aggressive and nuisance behaviors around the fishing bridge area. The bear had been relocated a few times but returned each time. Mr. Mernon believed that it was bear number 88 who pulled Brigitta Friedenhagen from her tent and ate her, and a few days later pulled a 12-year-old boy from his in a similar fashion. The difference was the boy slipped out of the sleeping bag while the bear dragged him away. Upon losing the boy, the young boar ran into the forest and abandoned his attack. Bear number 88 was euthanized in August of 1984. I trust the conclusions of Jerry Mernon and point to the fact that grizzly bear attacks involving people being pulled from their tents as they slept stopped immediately after bear number 88 was euthanized. After reviewing the details in this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Do you think the grizzly was defending its food cache from Brigitta's suspended food sack, or did it attack her out of strictly predatory motives? Since the bear was never identified, do you think it will have the inclination to kill and eat more people? Would the presence of Andreas and Yanko have deterred the bear from attacking Brigitta? Why do you think the park regulations would prevent anyone from carrying a firearm to protect themselves? Although she followed every instruction the authorities published in the many brochures and books she read, what more could Brigitta have done to ensure her safety? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.